Hey guys, today I'm going to go over, this is going to be two videos, but this part of it is going to be, how to wire up your Racepak Smartwire. So the next part of this video will be the software setup side. So I want to show you guys how I go about wiring up one of these. This is a Racepak Smartwire. This is a PDM. I made a little intro video to this a little while ago and then realized that I haven't really revisited this in a while. There's been a lot of questions about how to use this to eliminate all of your relays and whatnot in the car. So I figured I would show you guys how I do it. So for this car, I can't really show much of this car. This is about all I can show you. But anyway, there's one of these in the car, and I just pulled this one out of a box, out of inventory, so that I could show you, what it actually looks like. So depending on the Smartwire that you buy, some of them come with a pre-made harness, and some of them just come with a connector and pins. So if I'm wiring the car, I always suggest to the customer to save the money and buy the one with just the connector and pins, because I'm going to build the harness anyway, so there's no point in buying their pre-made harness. So there's a few tips in this to make your life a little bit easier, and you can also take some of this information and apply it to the rest of your wiring project. So the Smartwire replaces your relays and your fuses in the car, and it gives you a interface where you can program all of the outputs and all of the inputs to do whatever you want. So this is basically a high current version of your Holley ECU. So we can tell this thing to turn on output, whatever, based off of input whatever. It also has the ability to talk via CAN to keypads and switch panels. This particular car has this rocker switch panel, and I've done quite a few of them with both the keypad and the rocker switch panel. So what we got here is connector A. So with your Smartwire comes this piece of paper, and if it doesn't come with it, it's in the instructions and you can just print it out. So actually it doesn't come with it, my bad. I print these. So this is the 23-pin connector pinout. So you've got connector A over here and connector B over here. If we look over here, we've got A and B. So connector A, these are your inputs. So if you wanted to send a signal from your ECU, or maybe you've got like a rocker switch panel or something that you're using, you don't want to use the keypad, these are your inputs. So from your ECU, you'll have an output, and that turns into a Smartwire input. So hopefully that makes sense. And if you've got a different type of switch panel, you would use these inputs to turn on output. So you'd send power to your rocker switch panel, and then your output from each switch would be each individual input. So we've got 12 hardwired inputs, and then there's also expansion modules. So if you wanted to add an additional 16 inputs, you could. But with this car, we didn't need to. This is a race car that I'm working on, and it's a nitrous car. So we're going to control everything through the Smartwire. The only additional relay that we're going to have to add with this car is a NOS solid state relay to control the nitrous solenoids. So what I do, and hopefully this makes life a little easier for everybody, is I take this sheet, and if you look here, right there, those are 20 amp outputs, okay? So that means that those outputs are good for 20 amp continuous, and it tells you pin 1, 3, 6, and 8 on connector A are 20 amp. And those are the output channel numbers, right? So when you go into the software, you'll understand the output channel numbers in the middle. But this is what we're more concerned with here, is the pin number and the amperage count. So you can go to Walmart and you buy yourself, well, these don't come from Walmart, these come from TE when you spend way too much money with them. And you get yourself a multiple colored pen. And this is how I do it. So I just write this stuff down, and then this all gets put into an Excel spreadsheet when I'm all done, but it's easier for me to have just a piece of paper in front of me. So I write out my list of all of my inputs and all of my outputs for the Smartwire, and these are all 10 amp, right? So for this one, I made all the 10 amp ones black, I made all the 20 amp ones red, and then I made my inputs in blue. it's a little easier to just quick glance at it and figure out what you got going on. And then you have dedicated ground pins on both connector A and B. So my solution to that was kind of like black and red, but whatever. So we write it all down, and we've got pin 1 through 23, and then we start figuring out what we need in the car. And the way I do it is I try to segregate the car, you know, however this thing's going to be mounted in the car. I like to be able to build a nice clean harness that comes off of the connector and go kind of one direction, right? So if you've got half of the stuff that needs to go under the car to the transmission or into the back of the car for the taillights and stuff, do that on one connector, and then if you have to go under the hood for a bunch of stuff, do that on the other connector. So this kind of tidies things up as opposed to having wires crisscrossing all over the place and making a mess. So this way you can kind of have a bundle that goes out to different devices and does, you know, and lands where you want, so it's nice and clean. So once you've figured out your layout, you can write out a piece of paper like front of car is going to be the fan, the marker lights in the front, the fan join, starter, you know, fuel pump, all that kind of stuff. So you lay it all out so that you know, hey, Smartwire connector A is going to go to the front of the car, B is going to be for the underneath the car and the back of the car. So that's a little tip that I've always done that makes the install come out a little bit cleaner. The next thing is, if you notice, some of these are 20 amp, right? The red ones. If you notice, it says fan and then fan joined. So these outputs are good for 20 amp, but this fan draws about 40 amp on inrush and settles to right around 18, 19. So instead of just kind of chancing it, we had extra output capability with the Smartwire. When I was done writing all this up, I figured out everything that the car was going to need, and I noticed that we had some extra capacity. So what I did was you join fan and fan join. So that's going to be 2 wires coming out of the Smartwire, right? So if you look, they're gray. It's kind of hard to focus on. There you go. So there's the gray wires are what's going to go out to the fan. If you notice, there's 2 purple wires right next to each other. Those are starter, right? So this starter, when I hooked the power and ground up to it, it kind of inrushed right around 15 amp. So I'm using 2 10 amp channels to give me a 20 amp continuous, which really will handle an inrush of about 30-ish amps. But I joined these 2 together, and I'm running 2 wires out of the Smartwire connector to the starter. Nope, that's chassis ground. Where is it? There we go. Starter. So this is my starter lead, right? So there you go. It's kind of hard to read. Anyway, so there's my lead for the starter. So you've got the ability to join these together. Now, one thing I will say is you cannot join a 20 amp and a 10 amp together, because it's going to try to spread the load across both pins. And if it was to be 30 amp max, it's going to try to put 15 amp on pin 2 and 15 amp on pin 1. Pin 1 will be fine, but pin 2 will be a problem. So you can only join similar sized channels, right? So if you've got a 10 amp channel, you have to join it with another 10 amp channel. If you've got a 20 amp, you have to join it with another 20 amp. So hopefully that explains the joining of channels and kind of your layout of it. Now, it doesn't matter if you use connector A or B for anything, because both of them are identical as far as inputs and outputs. The only difference is on connector B, pin 20. If we look here, there it is. Connector A has got ground on 19 and 20. Connector B has got ground on 19, and then it's got a shutdown pin on pin 20. So if you apply ground to pin 20, it shuts this off. So it depends on how you plan on doing your master kill switch and whatnot. I noted this for this car to do not use, but what's actually going to happen here is this is going to tie into my kill switch wiring, so that when you hit the kill switch, it's going to shut off positive power to the main stud here, but it's also going to be grounding the channel here, so that even if there was a short, it's going to shut this thing off. So it will shut down the Smartwire, and it'll shut off all of your, obviously everything hooked up to it. So you don't have to use the shutdown pin, but it works pretty well. So, all right, next thing, once you have all this stuff laid out for your outputs, I lay out all my outputs first, right? So I ignored my inputs at first, and then I lay out all of my my outputs, right? So all this stuff, if you notice on connector A, is going to be either front interior or front of the engine, like in the engine bay. What I do then is I start using, I've done these in multiple videos, but these little tape measures, right? You get them from like a, whatever, Walmart or Amazon or whoever. They're cheap, they're really flexible, they work great, and it'll give you an idea of getting close to how long of a lead you need to make. So when building a harness like this, where it's going to be all sealed and it's going to have breakouts at certain points, like if you notice, like here's the main trunk, and then it hits a breakout, and then a couple different leads go a couple different directions. These little flexible guys work really well. So trying to jam a solid tape measure in there is a pain in the ass. So follow the curve of the way you're going to route the wiring, right? And this is also, these things will also teach you how much of a radius you kind of need for to make a bend. So you don't want a trunk of wire like this to come through and try to make a hard 90. Now this is twisted. This is a concentric twisted deal, so this will make a reasonably tight 90, but it's not going to be happy going to like an absolute hard 90, like a like a kind of like an elbow from like a fitting or something, So use your little tape measure and make note of how long everything's got to be. So fan gray, it's going to be 90 inches, right? My marker lights front, they're going to be 90 inches. I always round up, and I typically add about 10% to all of my measurements, because I'd rather throw like 6 or 10 inches of wire away than I would have to start all over. So it's cheaper to throw a little bit of wire away than it is to run 90 inches and you really needed 95. And then you have to, you're throwing the pin away because you've already pinned it, and you're throwing away the 90 inches of wire, or you're doing some ghetto crap that I don't suggest, and patching 5 inches more of wire. So add 10% to whatever your measurement is. So if this measured out to 90, make it 99. This measured out to, I think, around 80, so I just added 10 inches to it. So so you have all your measurements, right? And what I do then is, once I have all of my outputs, I figure out what hardwired inputs do I actually need. So with this car, we need a neutral safety input. We need the the little bump buttons underneath the hood to start the car or to turn it over to check valves. We have the brake switch. We have the line lock, and that's it for hardwired inputs. Everything else we're going to control through the ECU. So this car is going to have reverse lights. So what we're doing here is we're sending over 6 on this and 2 more on connector B, and we're going to turn, so when we want reverse lights on, the ECU has to see the trans brake anyway. Even though this is going to be powering the trans brake, the ECU has to see the trans brake anyway. So I'm going to wire the trans brake button straight back to the ECU. We're going to use an output from the ECU to turn into an input to the Smartwire, so that it will activate the trans brake and it'll activate the reverse lights. So you don't have to physically wire these 2 pins together, but you just do this in programming logic. For outputs, if you notice, these are 20 amp outputs. We ran out of the need for 20 amp outputs in the rear of the car. So what I did was I just sent these spares over to the ECU. So these are spare outputs from the Smartwire that turn into inputs from the ECU. You might ask, why would you need that? Well, you've got you've got a toggle switch up there to arm the nitrous. So this is going to be an input to the ECU to say, hey, nitrous is armed. These will be spares. So maybe when you turn the fan switch on, this will be an input to turn on something else, when you're cooling down the car. So I like to load these, I like to use every pin no matter what. So even if you lay all this out and you fill everything out on this sheet and you say, hey, I've got like 14 extra friggin' wires that ain't doing anything, I send them back and forth to the ECU because, you know, down the road you may decide that that's what you want to do. I had a customer at one time who wanted to do an override on the trans brake to back up. So he wanted to be able to throw one of his rocker switches to make it go in reverse as opposed to holding the trans brake button. So by having these additional spares to the ECU, we were able to do that pretty easily with just programming logic. So throw your spares in there, take good measurements, and then start crimping. So crimping these terminals, these terminals suck. I'm just going to be honest. They're hard to see. They don't suck to crimp. It sucks to populate them. These connectors are a pain in the ass, but this is what we got. So in order to, once they're crimped, in order to terminate it, if you notice, this is up. This is in the unlocked position, and that's the locked position. It needs to be unlocked in order to populate this connector. And what I highly suggest you do is after every couple of wires that you've crimped and then you've populated in this connector, I suggest you unlock it. So let's grab where is it? Sorry, I'm a little bit of a mess. Here, there's like a little, we need this thing. Yeah. So, if you need to crack open this thing and unlock it, you would take a flathead, small flathead. It's gonna be, I can't do this, you know, with one hand, especially with my one useless hand, but you would get a flathead up under there at that corner, and there you go. Pop, it's open, and then come over to the other corner and do the same thing. So that's how you would disengage the lock on this connector. So I suggest after every couple of pins that you populate to test fit and lock it. Now if you look in here, there you go. So you can see all the pins are flush up at the top of that red wedge lock. If you have a pin, if you go to push this in and it's really hard, you either have a pin that's in too far deep or not deep enough, and it's not allowing the lock to engage. So you'll learn quick that the lock on this thing is a pain in the ass, but it works well once you actually, you know, take a little bit of time and do it correctly. So, you know, disengage and re-engage this lock occasionally while you're populating this connector, because you certainly don't want to get all 23 wires in there and then realize, shit, half of them ain't in deep enough or half of them are in too deep. So, you know, check it periodically. It's a lot easier to get them in correctly and then close it, then reopen it a couple times to confirm. As far as crimping the terminals, it's gonna be hard to see. Okay, so you see the little wings there? That's to grab onto the insulation, and then this area right here, that's to grab onto the conductor. So you'll strip your wire back, and what works really well with these is the standard Sargent blue economy crimper. So, my hand's useless. So, anyway, let's do this. Here we go. So, these crimpers, you can pick them up from Racepak. They're made by Sargent. They are like $40. They work really well. They work well for a variety of terminals. So I'm not going to tell you crimp settings because it really depends on gauge of wire and whatnot. What I will say though is that when you start getting down into the 22 gauge for some of the ECU signals, you're going to have to take some caution and do it a little bit slow. Just watch what you're doing, and you'll see exactly what I mean. Just take your time crimping them, and you won't have any problems. So anyway, I think I covered just about everything when it comes to wiring up one of these things. And again, oh, something I forgot. This thing doesn't output ground. So those ground pins that we talked about right here, those have to go to a ground on the car. It's suggested that all three of these grounds go to 3 different locations. what I have found to do is typically I ground these two at one location and this one at a different location. And you tie them all, you don't want to tie them all to the same location. But what I do in my harnesses, and I'm not saying that this is what you have to do, but I integrate all of my chassis grounding into this, right? So you figure out where your ground is going to be, and my grounds come through here from the connector down here, and they end here. The two wires end here from connector A. There's also the ground wire for interior lights in there. I put it in there. There's also the ground wire for the, what is this? The passenger side AEM O2 box. There's also the ground wire for a few other small things. And then that was all the stuff that's in the interior. So the purge solenoid, so they're all tied together and they're grounded at one location here. And then for connector B, it'll be grounded at a different location. So I send a floating ground to some of the interior items, right? So they're not a far run. Now like these, like the headlight, the fan, the fuel pump, the water pump, that kind of stuff, that is populated closer to the device, right? It's populated on the chassis closer to the device. But it doesn't hurt to pre-plan a little bit and add your grounds inside of your loom that will be going to each interior close device to the Smartwire. So hopefully that answered a bunch of questions. And I'll be doing a video here shortly on setting up the software and how to program the software and how to make all of this stuff actually work. I'll probably work on that a little bit later today. So thanks. See you.